OpenAI just released the Agent Builder. This makes it easy to build complex agentic workflows by dragging nodes onto a canvas. So in this crash course, you'll learn everything there is to know to get up and running with the Agent Builder. You'll learn how to build a customer-facing assistant, which you can embed into any application using ChatKit. So, for example, we can click on this little chat button and we can start interacting with our agent. Then we'll have a deeper look at the Agent Builder by building this deep research agent. And this uses a lot of very cool features like agents, setting state, human-in-the-loop approval, running agents in a loop, and we'll cover some other cool features along the way. But first, let's have a look at what the Agent Builder is, and more importantly, what it is not. I've seen a lot of content saying this is the Zapier killer or the N8N killer, and this can't be further from the truth. Whereas N8N and Zapier are process automation tools with some AI functionality, the Agent Builder puts more of an emphasis on building agent workflows using the Agent SDK from OpenAI. It forms part of what is called the Agent Kit, and the Agent Kit includes a whole bunch of features that developers can use to build agentic solutions in their applications. Agent Kit comes with the Agent Builder, which is a visual tool that we can use to prototype our agent workflows. It also comes with the connector Registry, which is a central place for admins to manage how data and tools connect to OpenAI products. And finally, it comes with ChatKit, which is a tool for embedding these agents into your products. And that is what we use to embed the agent into this website. I think a lot of creators are creating a misperception of what this tool is intended for by calling it a Zapier or N8N killer. Although this tool offers some integration capabilities, it's really up to the developer to export these workflows and then add those into their applications. As a really simple example, if we assign a tool like the getWeather tool, we can of course provide the JSON schema that the agent will use to call this tool. But it will still be up to the developer to actually implement the execution logic for this tool call. This will not be handled by the Agent Builder. So if you wanted a very simple way to prototype Agent SDK-based applications, then this tool is perfect for you. And in this video, you'll learn all the ins and outs of using it. To start, go to platform.openai.com/agentbuilder. Initially, you won't see any workflows. So let's create one. Let's click on Create, and this will give you this very simple canvas with a start node and an agent node. On the left-hand side, we can see all of the available nodes. Then in the top right, we have a few options, like we can duplicate or rename these workflows. I'm actually going to rename this one right now. So let's call this Agent Basics, and let's save this. Then we can also run evaluations against these agents. If we click on Code, we can see the different ways of integrating this workflow into our projects. We can use ChatKit to embed the agent into something like a website, and if you're familiar with using the Agent SDK, this will generate all the behind-the-scenes code for you. So all you really have to do is copy this code. Of course, you can switch between TypeScript and Python, but you can simply copy this code and add it to your project. And of course, if you're using agentic coding, you can simply take this code and pass it to something like Claude Code or Bolt or Lovable and ask it to add this agent to your project. The preview button will allow us to test out this workflow, and once we're done, we can go ahead and publish our workflow, which will allow us to use it in our applications. By default, we start off with a start node and an agent node. We can delete a node either by clicking on it and then clicking on the trash icon behind my face. Alternatively, we can just press backspace and that will remove the node as well. Now let's have a look at the start node. In the start node, we receive one input variable called input as text. We will be able to reference this variable anywhere in our workflow. So whenever we want to see the original message that was passed by the user, we can also add global state variables in this state variable section. So let's click on add. And for instance, let's add a new variable called name, and let's add a value called Leon. Then let's save this. So with this single node, let's actually click on preview, and let's just say, hey. Of course, this is not very helpful. We can see the start node was called, but no response is being written out in the chat window. If we wanted to receive a response and a structured output, what we can do is add an end node. And by the way, there are a few ways in which we can add nodes. We can drag and drop it like I just did, or we can actually just grab the output from this node and just drop this on the canvas, and then let's select our end node. Cool. Now, this end node is optional. If the final node in your workflow is an agent, then you really don't need an end node. We'll simply stream back the response from the agent. But if you would like to return structured output or see additional values that were generated in your workflow, then the end node is perfect for that. Let me show you. So we can add an output schema to this. Then let's give this a name like response. And now we can define the structure in two very different ways. Either we can add properties using this UI, or we can go to advanced mode and simply drop in a JSON schema. Because this is so simple, I'm just going to add a new property, and let's call this name. We also need to assign a type, and this is of type string. And then for the value, we can of course just hardcode something, or we can change this to select, and this will allow us to select from any of the variables in this workflow. So remember, we had that input as text variable, which is basically the input message from the chat window. Or we can also grab our state variables, like the name property. Of course, we can add more properties if we want, or we can click on update, and if we run preview now, let's say hey, we can see the start node executed, followed by the end node, and then we get the response in the structured format. So we get the name back as Leon, which is coming from our state variables. We will be using state quite a lot during these workflows. Right, let's move on to building our first agent. So let's drag in a new node, let's select agent, and now we can rename the agent to something like assistant, and now we can enter the system prompt. So I'm actually going to expand this, and let's say, you are a helpful assistant called John. And then I'm just going to add some context. So we can say you are chatting to, and now I want to refer to that state variable containing my name. So there's a couple of ways to do that. The more technical approach is to enter double curly braces, and this will bring up all the variables in the workflow. Or an easier way is to click on add context and then selecting that variable. Cool. Let's also say always refer to the user by their name. Cool, let's save this. And if we wanted to, we can actually add more messages. By default, this will add a user message, but we can switch the role to assistant as well. And this way we can maybe do something like few-shot prompting, where we can simulate the back and forth between the user and the assistant. I'm going to remove this. Then we have the option to include the entire chat history in the conversation. I'll just leave this enabled. And of course, we can select our model. So I'll just select GPT-5 Mini. And these models are limited to OpenAI's models. Again, this is using the Agent SDK from OpenAI, and this leans heavily into using the OpenAI ecosystem. And that's why it's so painful to see other creators call this a Zapier or N8N or Flowwise killer, because this is not aimed at that audience at all. This is really a wrapper around the Agent SDK. Anyway, let's move on to reasoning effort. I'll leave this at low. And then we can also assign tools. So under tools, we have a few options. We can integrate with ChatKit client tools, MCP servers, file search, web search, and we even have access to a code interpreter. We can also define local functions or custom tools. For this, let's actually add web search. In here, we can specify specific websites if we wanted to narrow the search. And of course, we can add localization details like the country, time zones, etc. I'm just going to leave everything on blank and click on add. Alright, cool. Let's go ahead and preview this agent and let's say, hey. And look at that, the agent is greeting me using my name. And let's ask it to do a web search like, what is the latest news from OpenAI? Alright, we can see the assistant is running and it is indeed performing a web search. And finally, we get our search results. Awesome. Right, before we move on to implementing the research agent, let me show you how you can now integrate this simple assistant into any website. Well, the first thing we need to do is click on publish, then let's give our agent a name and click on publish again. This will give you this Webflow ID. Now, I also want to mention that the version changed from draft to version 1. And that's a really cool feature about Agent Builder. It already includes version control. So of course we can deploy multiple versions of this and roll back to a previous version if needed. Either way, back to code. We can choose to embed this using ChatKit or the Agents SDK. Now, because I want to embed this chatbot into my website, I'll simply go to ChatKit. Optionally, we can provide the domain from which this workflow will be accessed. This will prevent other people from integrating our agents into their projects. Since we live in the era of agentic coding, adding this to your project is really simple. The first thing you'll need is your OpenAI API key. You can get that from platform.openai.com/API keys. Then let's create a new key. I'll give it a name like Agent Builder Tutorial. Let's click on Create Secret Key. Then let's copy this. And now simply make a note of it, as you will have to pass it to your coding agent if you are using something like Lovable or Bolt. Since I'm building a local Next.js project, I'm simply going to create a new .env file. Then in this file, I'll create a new variable called OpenAI API key, and then pass in that key. Now we also want to note down this workflow ID. You can pass that to your coding agent, or if you're following along locally, in a .env file, call it something like OpenAI ChatKit workflow ID, which is equal to this workflow ID. Cool. So now we can close this file. Of course, now we can spin up our agent, which could be Bolt or Lovable, or locally it could be Cursor, Claude Code, Codex, whatever. It really doesn't matter. I'll simply spin up Claude Code. And by the way, if you want to learn all the ins and outs of learning Claude Code, then check out my Claude Code Masterclass video over here. Also link it in the description. Ideally, we want to give our coding agent a little bit more context on what ChatKit actually is and how to use it. So what I recommend is creating a new folder somewhere. I'll just call it docs. And within this, I'll create a subfolder called OpenAI. And within this, a file called chatkit.md. Then I'll also link to this page in the description. These are the instructions for embedding ChatKit, so it gives us all of this example code. So it gives us the backend logic, as well as the logic for the front end. Now all we have to do is copy this page and paste it into this file. Now let's tell our agent, I would like to embed my agent workflow into this app. Below you will find the documentation on implementing ChatKit. The OpenAI API key and the workflow ID are available in the .env file as, I'll just grab these names. Then let's also say, this should be accessed using a bubble on the bottom right of the screen that will open and close this chat window. And that's really it. I can just leave this on thinking on and fire off this instruction. And I just noticed I never actually included the documentation. So what I'll do is simply grab the docs that I stored and add it to the chat window. Or as I mentioned, you can simply paste all the content from the website directly into the chat window. So now that we have this context, we can send this, and the agent should be able to implement the solution. And afterwards we'll have something like this, where you have this button where we can open and close the chat window, and of course we can interact with our agent. So let's say hey, and we get our response back from our agent workflow. Cool. Now, before we move off from this simple workflow, there is one more feature I want to show you, and that is this guardrails node. So when users are interacting with your agent, you might want to first look at the content coming in to perform some moderation on it. For example, we might want to identify personal information or block harmful content using moderation. In fact, let's enable this toggle. Then we can break this connection between these two nodes by clicking on this line, also called an edge, and then simply deleting it. Then let's connect the start node to guardrails, and then guardrails will look at the message from the chat window. And by the way, we can change the variable that we want to look at, but in this case, we just want to look at the message from the chat window and see if there's any issue with it. If moderation fails, we'll go down this fail path. So I'll just connect an end node. So basically we'll just immediately terminate the workflow, but of course you can trigger another agent that could provide a message back to the user saying something like, I'm sorry, but I can't help you with that. or if we pass moderation, we'll move on to the agent. Next, we'll build something a lot more complex. We'll build a deep research agent that will really teach you the fundamentals of using the Agent Builder. Right, so let's create a new workflow. And how this will work is a user will provide a topic in the chat window, and we then want our agent to come up with several keywords to research, and then our deep research agent will actually perform research on each of those keywords, and finally, we'll spit out a detailed report covering all of the research data. On the start node, let's add a new state variable, and we'll call this topic. And by default, the topic will be empty. Let's save this. Then I'm going to delete this agent node, and actually let's also rename this node to Deep Research Demo. Cool. So what will happen is the user will provide some topic, like what are the differences between GPT-5, GPT-5 Nano, and GPT-5 Mini? And the first thing I want to do is when the user sends this, we want to store this topic in our state variable. So what we'll do is after start, we'll add a new node, and let's add the set state node. And you'll see me use the set state node quite a few times during this tutorial. In the Agent Builder, everything really relies on you setting and retrieving state. So let's click on this node, and what we'll do is assign a value, and this is really easy. We'll simply grab the input from the chat window, and we'll assign it to our topic state variable. Now that we have our topic, we want to use an agent to come up with different keywords that we can use to research this topic even further. So of course, let's add an agent node, and then let's rename this agent to keyword agent, and under the instructions, let's say your role is to generate 3 keyword phrases based on the provided topic. This will be used to perform further research into the topic and return the list of keywords. And of course, we'll provide our topic, and to get that topic variable, all we have to do is click on Add Context and select Topic from our state. I actually also want this value to be dynamic, so I'm going to go back to Start. Let's add a new variable. This time we'll add a number, and let's call this number of keywords. And then for the default value, let's make it 3. Let's save this. So then back in our agent, let's replace this 3 with a variable. So let's click on Add Context. Let's grab number of keywords. I'm just going to cut it from the bottom and add it over here. So now we have a dynamic value that we can adjust using the start node. Alright, let's save this. For the model, I'll change it to GPT-5 Mini with low reasoning. That should be fine. I do want to change the output though. Instead of the agent returning text, we actually want an array of values, so that we can iterate through that list when we're doing our research. So under output format, let's change it from text to JSON. Then let's add a schema, and again we can try to manually build the schema using this UI, but to keep things interesting, let's change this from simple to advanced. And now we can ask the Agent Builder to create a schema for us. So under generate, let's say the agent should respond with a list of keyword phrases as text. Let's click on create, and this returns this object which contains an array of keywords. Let's update this, and of course we can have a look at it at any time. So we can see we get this array back containing keywords. Cool. Let's run this in preview, and let's send our topic. We can see our agent is running, and it is indeed responding with this object containing an array of keywords. Cool. Another useful feature is we do have observability with these agents. You will notice that below each response, we get this link, and if we click on this, these logs will show us exactly what happened behind the scenes. And indeed, we can see we received this JSON object. Right, let's continue. So now that we have these keywords, we want to save these results in our state. So again, we'll go back to our start node. Let's add another property, and let's call this one keywords. This will be of type object. And of course, now we have to add our schema. And you might be wondering, what should the schema look like? Well, thankfully, that's really simple. We can simply match the schema to whatever this response schema from the agent is. So we could try to manually map it like this, or we can go to advanced. Let's just copy all of this. Then Let's go back to start. Let's add our property. Let's select object. I'm just going to call this keywords. Let's add our schema. Let's click on advanced and let's paste in that schema. Cool. Let's click on update. And now it should be really easy to map the response from the agent to the state variable. So after the agent, we'll again add our set state node. So let's first select our variable. From our global state, we want to grab this keywords object. And for the value, let's grab the keywords array within output parsed. I'm just going to run preview to make sure everything is still working. So let's run this. And we were able to execute set state without any error messages. Of course, if we wanted to see exactly what happened in set state, we can actually simply add an end node. Then under schema, under properties, I'm just going to add keywords, which is of type array. And then for the value, let's select, and let's grab our keywords array from state. Let's update this. And now in the preview window, we should be able to see the list of keywords from our workflow state, which we do. So now that we have our list of keywords, we want to iterate over each phrase to perform a web search. So how do we iterate over these values? Well, what we can do is add this while node. Then anything we add into this node will be executed in a loop until a certain condition is met. So let's actually attach this. And now what we want to do is add an expression that will say that this needs to run for however many items we have in our keywords array. Now this is also a good point to mention that the Agent Builder relies heavily on the common expression language. So we can click on this link to learn more. So we can see a few examples of what these expressions actually look like. But to be quite honest, ChatGPT is really well trained on this already. So if you ever wanted to learn how to write any of these expressions, you can just go to ChatGPT and say, hey, I've got an array of values, use common expression language to loop through those items. So what we'll do is we'll keep track of the current iteration and we'll increase that value until it's equal or less than the maximum amount of items in our array. It's similar to a for loop if you're familiar with programming. So what we can do is go to our start node. Let's add another value to state. This will be a number, and let's call this current underscore iteration. By default, this will be 0. Then let's save this. Then let's click on our while node, and our expression will be state.current iteration. And now we can see a bunch of comparisons. So we'll just say as long as it's less than the number of keywords. So at this stage, we know that the number of keywords would be 3, and our starting position is 0. And the reason we're starting at 0 is the 0 position in the array will contain the first value. Either way, just know this will run 3 times. The first thing we want to do in this loop is to grab the keyword that we're currently on. So to do that, we can add the set state node, and now we have to assign some value to some variable. Again, we'll just add another state value, so click on start, click on add, and this will be a string, and what we can call it is current keyword. And by default, this value will be blank. Let's save this. Then let's go to this set state node, and let's select it from the list of variables. Now for the value, we'll simply use the common expression language again. And again, I simply use ChatGPT to generate these expressions for me. But what we can do is say state.keywords. And now we can specify which record we want to grab from this array by adding these square brackets. And we can provide a number like 0, which will grab the first record in the list. Or if we provide 1, this will grab the second record. And for a value of 2, we'll grab the record in the third position, etc. But of course, we want this to be dynamic. We want to grab the value based on the current iteration that we're on. So again, we're also keeping track of that in state. So let's call state dot, and it was called current iteration. Great. So now this is dynamically grabbing the values, and we're storing the current keyword in this state. So the next step is to now pass this keyword to an agent to go and perform research based on that keyword. So I'm just going to break this edge. Then let's add a new agent. And then for the system prompt, let's say Your role is to perform deep research into a topic using a specific keyword. Use the web search tool to retrieve the 3 most relevant articles related to the keyword. Return a detailed search report in Markdown format. Then I'm just passing in the topic as well, and of course, the keyword that we're currently on. Let's save this. Then under Tools, let's add the web search tool. I'm not going to specify anything here. Let's just click on Add. And that should be good enough, actually. Now, at the moment, this is actually going to run in an infinite loop, because this while will only exit if the current iteration is less than the number of keywords. So what we need to do is increase this value every time we run this loop. So after the agent node, let's run setState, and then for the value, we'll say, let's grab the current iteration, and we'll simply add 1 to this value. And cool, we should be able to give this a spin. So let's go to preview. Let's send our prompt again. So we have our list of keywords. We can see the while is executing and we're running our first agent. The agent is currently searching the web as well. And now the first agent is generating its results. Now that that agent's done, we've actually moved on to the second agent. And of course, that agent is now performing its research, and we should see the results in a second. You know what would be really cool? If we could approve those keywords before actually moving on with this research phase. The research phase can take some time to execute because it's going online and retrieving articles. So a really cool optimization would be to add some human-in-the-loop functionality here. So before we call this loop, I'm actually going to break this connection. Then let's add user approval. So I'm going to connect this node to user approval, and only if the user approves the step will we move on to this research phase. If they reject this, we'll simply end this workflow. So under user approval, let's say something like, would you like to proceed with these keywords? Alright, then let's open preview. Let's run our query. And this time the workflow actually stopped at the user approval node. So we can see our keywords, and now it's saying, would you like to proceed with these keywords or not? So if we reject this workflow will simply terminate. And I do want to mention, you can actually inject dynamic values in this prompt as well. So if you wanted to refer to those keywords, you can definitely do that as well. So we can simply grab this value and inject it into this text. Alright, our workflow is looking really cool. So the next step is to add one more agent, and we'll just say, your role is to consolidate all the research that the agents created before you to build out a detailed and structured report for the user based on their topic. So it could look something like this. Then of course, let's add our topic into this. And because this agent has a view of the chat history, it's able to see all the results generated by the agents before it, and that will allow it to generate this final report. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. This is simply a crash course, and there's a lot more we can do with OpenAI's Agent Builder. So please let me know in the comments if you would like me to create more videos on the Agent Builder and what specific topics you would like me to cover. Also remember to like this video and to subscribe to my channel to stay up to date with more Agent Builder videos. Also check out this other video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.